Welcome back. This is the Globe on SABC News. Thank you so much for staying with us. Now, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature released a report this week that painted a grim picture about risks facing African elephants. It says African elephants living in forests and savannas are increasingly threatened with extinction. The report says the dramatic decline in the elephant population is mainly due to poaching for ivory and humans encroaching in their habitat. Dr. Dave Balfour is a member of the six-person IUCN Red List Assessment team that has worked over the past 3 years on the most recent assessment of African elephants. He joins us now via Zoom from Cape Town. Dr. Balfour, a very good evening to you. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the Globe.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Now, do put these figures in perspective for us, Dr. Balfour. A 60% decline in the number of African savanna elephants in the last 50 years and an 86% decline in forest elephants in 31 years. So what is the difference between these two species and why are these numbers so alarming?
Well, it's a big question, really. I think the big issue is that the forest elephants, which are the ones that have gone through the most dramatic decline, that's the 86% decline over the last 31 years, they're largely confined to central and central and western Africa. And they live in those tropical jungle areas. And they've been heavily poached for their ivory. The savanna elephants, which is much more widely distributed outside of that forested area, they've been more successfully conserved in many countries, including in the southern African region that we live in. And so although the numbers have declined, they haven't declined as dramatically. But the primary reason behind it has been poaching for ivory and habitat loss because of human development. The land is being used in other ways.
And I suppose, Dr. Balfour, that elephants offer a whole lot more to our environment rather than just being, watching them at game parks. So what is that benefit that elephants have on our environment that warrants us to preserve them?
Well, I think it's multifaceted, isn't it? There's very strong cultural links to elephants globally, let alone here in Africa. Mm-hmm. There are also ecosystem links. Elephants have huge impacts on ecosystems and what they do, breaking down trees, opening up areas for the grasses to grow, creates habitat for other species. And as a species that moved historically across the continent, wide-ranging, they were from deserts through to forests, they were everywhere. So one of the problems we have in today's society is we've confined them to these very small spaces. And that means we're missing them in a lot of the world, and we need to desperately try and keep them as much as we can where they still remain.
Yeah. And we know that overhunting for ivory is one of the long-standing drivers for, elephant killings. And this is a well-known factor all around the world. I mean, why is this? Why is this so? Why has it proven so difficult to curb this practice? Is it perhaps a lack of capacity, or is it simply the lack of willingness from our authorities to deal decisively with this issue?
I don't think it's a lack of willingness at all. I think sometimes capacity is an issue. When the poacher, illegal hunter, however one wants to term it, always has the initiative and the advantage. So when you're on the side of the people who are trying to conserve those animals, the elephants, you have to have good relationships with the neighboring communities through which poachers need to move. You need to have effective law enforcement. You need to have effective legal systems and legal structures operating in the country. And this takes a lot, and they're not always in place. So the challenges for protection are huge, and the demand is there. People who get hold of ivory and who can sell it in the consumer countries make a lot of money out of it. Mm-hmm. So it's a very unbalanced equation.
And there's now a call from conservationists to sort of, take urgent action to end poaching. So what kind of action are you looking for, and from whom?
Well, I think maybe I've said some of those. You need effective legislation. You need a judicial system that is supportive and engaged in stopping the illegal transit of ivory out of countries. You also need to prevent the animals being killed in the first place. And that means you need effective engagement with people who live around these protected areas where the elephants live. Anybody wanting to get in there to shoot an elephant to get the ivory is going to have to go through local villages, etc. So you need support of local communities, but you also need an effective law enforcement capacity within the protected area. And I think if you have those tiered structures in place, you're going to stand a pretty good chance of protecting the animals.
Yeah. And just last year, more than 330 elephants were found dead at the Okavango Delta in Botswana, and another 39 were found dead this year in the same country. I mean, it begs the question, are these numbers perhaps reflected in the survey conducted by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the answer quickly is no. The data set that we worked on ran up until 2015. So it's from the very earliest data that we could get, which was back in the 1950s, 1960s, right through to 2015. Any data that's come in after that hasn't been through the full verification process within the IUCN African Elephant Database system. So that wouldn't have been picked up. But the truth is simply we're 350 elephants out of 125,000 elephants roughly that are in the Kaiser region. It's a small ecological blip. It's not the kind of problem that we're talking about when we're talking about the large-scale losses from poaching. Those are much bigger losses that we're talking about.
Okay. And just how significant are the natural or the mysterious circumstances perhaps in driving the decline in elephant population here on the African continent?
Sorry, I missed the beginning of your question, but I think we understand pretty well what's driving the decline. There are these small outbreaks of mortality, which may be through disease, there may be through some toxicity in a plant. It can vary, but they're not the primary drivers at all of the mortality and the death, the loss that we're seeing.
Yeah, yeah. And the kind of declines that are mentioned in the IUCN, can they be reversed? And if not, what happens if they are not reversed?
So firstly, absolutely, they can be reversed.
Okay.
It requires that the necessary effort is put in place, and what I discussed earlier about the provisions that need to be there. If they're in place, I think we can make a pretty good effort to reverse losses. If we don't succeed in that, well, with the forest elephants and this recent listing as critically endangered, they're in real danger of sometime in the not too distant future of going extinct. The savanna elephant it's less critical, but they're also at risk. And that's what this whole red listing process is about, is to raise the flag and say, hang on, guys, there's a problem out there. We should start dealing with it. So that is why getting the news out like this is really useful, really important, and just highlighting the need for these changes.
I mean, one of the reasons perhaps which can be attributed to the decline in the elephant population here on the African continent is that they're losing their habitat as a result of humans chopping down trees. I mean, one could argue perhaps that this is a result of, it's for economic purposes, because some trees are used to drive, economic activity in some countries. So how would you come in that kind of argument?
So that's correct. There is, as we know, the human population in Africa is growing, and in the next 20, 30, I think, or 40 years' time, we can anticipate another 1 billion people. So there's a massive growth of the human population, and that's going to take up space, and that's going to require resources. And I think we're all aware of that. So what is happening at the moment is a lot of work is going in to find ways where humans and elephants can coexist, and identifying areas which can be then set aside for wildlife in general, not only elephants, to continue living in. So we've got to find this mix of coexistence and protected areas that works. And there's an enormous amount of work going into that in many African countries to see how that can happen. But the pressure is on, and we need to find solutions quickly.
Yeah, and in terms of finding solutions quickly, Dr. Balfour, how then do we help in curbing the decline of the elephant populations?
You know, in the short term, we've got to do what's necessary immediately. And so that's ensure that fewer people get into parks and kill elephants, that those who are trading in ivory and trying to transport it off the continent, that their routes are interrupted and that they're not successful. In the longer term, it's a much bigger societal problem where people who are working in this field need to engage with regional planners around how landscapes get zoned to accommodate both humans and wildlife, including elephants. And that work has been... The project of the next 10 to 15 years is to just limit the illegal killing and to limit the illegal removal and transport of ivory off the continent.
Okay, great chatting to you, Dr. Balfour. Thank you so much for your time.
Great, good to talk.
All right, that is Dr. Dave Balfour from the IUCN's African Elephant Specialist Group, just speaking to us about, the declining populations of elephants on the African continent.